Well, I look at this as a seminar in star law because the moon is just the beginning, and who knows where we're going to go. And if you're wondering why I am here and want more detail, there is a book called Return to the Moon that would give you an idea of why in the world I got involved in this. And I'm going to summarize one of the chapters, in a way, in that book that deals with the current, what I see as the current situation with respect to space law as it may apply to the access of lunar resources. The primary reason that I got interested was due to a contact that was made with me in 1986, as a matter of fact, by now colleagues at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They had realized that in a sample that Neil Armstrong brought back, and the reports of analyses of that sample, and if you like numbers, 100084 is the number of that sample, that there was a potential resource in the debris layer that covers the moon, what we call the lunar regolith, that offered an opportunity for extraordinarily long-term supplies of clean fusion fuel, and that is this helium-3 that John mentioned. Helium-3 is a light isotope of helium that, when fused with itself, produces only protons and alpha particles. That is, it's aneutronic. And neutrons are the bad actors in nuclear power production. They produce all the waste that we talk about that needs to be taken care of. And also, they can only be converted to energy by going through what's called a heat cycle or a Carnot cycle, and that limits the efficiency of such power plants to the same as coal power plants or natural gas power plants or what have you. They're all limited by that heat cycle at about 30 to 35% efficiency. Well, if you can convert protons and alpha particles directly to electricity, then you can raise that efficiency possibly as much as a factor of 2. They became very excited about this potential resource of helium-3 in relatively nearer space, because the Earth does not have any significant quantity of helium-3. It's a primordial element on Earth. The little bit that we have, very little bit that we have, is left over from the formation of the solar system. Whereas the helium-3 on the moon is produced in the sun, and it comes to the moon by way of the solar wind. And some of it is retained in the soil of the moon. It may be retained significantly near the poles because of coal trapping, but we don't know. We haven't sampled the poles yet. Hopefully Artemis, the new program of this administration, will give us samples that will tell us that, or we may get them through the private sector. There's a great deal of a very interesting effort going on right now to see if there is a business case for the private sector, for private investors to access not only helium-3, but other resources on the moon for use there and potentially for exploration of Mars. So that's sort of the background of why I'm here. I'm not a lawyer. I don't play one on TV. I did read law with Adlai Stevenson for a term in the United States Senate, but that's my purpose is not to act like a lawyer, other than you'll probably see that I do to some degree. This is what I'm standing on there in the Valley of Tarsilitro is the lunar regolith. That material, about half of that material is less than 100 microns in average diameter. It is very, very fine dust. But that's where your resource is. It's mostly in the surface and near surface portions of each particle of dust. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. This is Neil Armstrong on the moon 50 years ago this year, collecting that 100084 sample that got us on the trail of these lunar resources, so what we call solar wind resources. I had an opportunity to work with Neil a great deal through the years, and at one point I asked him why did he collect so much of this lunar regolith sample. And he said, well, when I looked at the rock box, it already collected a large number, a very diverse suite of rocks from around the Eagle landing craft. And he said it still looked empty, so I just filled up the box with dirt. And Neil was probably the best observer we ever put on the moon in a short amount of time. He only had about 20 minutes for this kind of activity. And we are benefiting greatly from it. Now, space law, the only really operative major treaty in space is the 1967 Space Treaty. It has a much longer name, which I won't try to repeat, generally referred to as the Outer Space Treaty. And I interpret it, and if you ever look at this book, you'll see in chapter 12, I try to make the case that that treaty is permissive, so long as signatories to the treaty oversee the activities of their constituents that might be involved. The national regulatory environment is overseen now by the Department of Commerce, the FAA in part, but also in other ways. There is also an international consensus organization called the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. I've actually participated in some of their plenipotentiary conferences, and it is an interesting organization, but it does try to operate by consensus. But still, every nation that has telecommunications activity, and that's essentially everybody, has a very strong interest in making this particular union work, which is very unusual for international organizations. They all need to communicate. And I might mention that is one of the reasons why the Inmarsat and the Intelsat organizations worked, is that everybody had a fiduciary interest in making sure that those organizations worked and did indeed reach consensus that was useful to all the participants. Something that I discuss a little bit in that book. Now, in 1979, the United Nations organization that deals with space produced the Moon Agreement. It has technically entered into force. I think it only took, for some reason, they only required 5 nations to ratify it in order to enter into force. But none of the major spacefaring nations have ever ratified that. And there's a good reason for that, is because it would have stopped almost everything related, in fact, everything related to lunar resources dead in its tracks, except maybe prospecting and scientific work. Because it would require an international organization to oversee the actual acquisition of those resources. And that in turn almost certainly would dry up any kind of capital that might be applied to this kind of activity. It is not permissive in any way. And as I said, it requires an international management structure. Also, we had in 1998 the International Space Station Agreement between a number of nations. It was a multilateral agreement, not an international agreement. But, and that might have some, what should you say, a presumptive influence on any future activity in deep space, but maybe or maybe not. Now, the background for space law, as it developed for the Outer Space Treaty, certainly began in a major way with maritime law. There are national mining laws, a variety of national mining laws. That mining law in the United States and Australia is relatively unique in that it involves the private sector, and it allows that the extracted resource, even on public lands, be owned by the extractor. That's in most other mining law regimes that I'm aware of, the state basically owns everything, including the extracted resource. National regulatory law in the United States, as it relates to space, there are a variety of commercial space acts through the years that have been enacted by Congress and signed into law. And there, as I indicated earlier, that is largely under the jurisdiction of the Department of Commerce to implement those regulations, create and implement. National tax law, of course, has a major effect on private sector interest in space resources. And I have to pause here for a minute and just remind everybody that the private sector is deeply involved in space already. Investment, publicly traded companies, as well as some that are not traded, are particularly involved in communication satellites and communication law. Telecommunications is largely dependent on space now. And that is except for those that are required for national security purposes, that is a multi-billion-dollar industry that we tend to take for granted now as we use our various telecommunications equipment necessary for almost everything we're doing on Earth today. Now, the Antarctic Treaty, basically of 1959, but with subsequent negotiations after that, was considered by some to be a potential model for activities involving the moon and other celestial bodies. It probably is not a good example because I believe it was the 1988 renegotiation that prohibited any kind of resource activity in Antarctica. The space law, as I see it, the Outer Space Treaty of '67 does not prohibit that, and we'll get more into that in a moment. But there was a great deal of concern among environmental groups that the original treaty would have allowed for commercial activities in Antarctica. It did establish a regulatory structure to deal with that, but in 1988 they got rid of that and just prohibited it. That may have been a mistake, because any nation that decides they want Antarctic resources can opt out of the treaty and go get them. And it might have been better to have a regulatory structure rather than to just allow that opting out, and then that nation might go forward with extracting those resources. So the Antarctic Treaty is, in my opinion, is not a good structure for dealing with anything that has potential great benefit to human beings here on Earth. Then we got the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, the Moon Agreement of '79, and another factor in this was the Law of the Sea Convention that was, again, a creature of the United Nations. In 1982, has not been ratified by the United States, has been ratified by many other nations. If I remember correctly, about 110 nations that have participated in that. But again, the Law of the Sea Convention establishes an international organization to control access to deep sea resources. And nothing has happened with respect to deep sea resources for good reason. Now, in 1984, the United States, France, Great Britain, a few other nations developed a deep sea resources agreement that basically defined how they would recognize other nation activity in the deep sea to try to access the resources, which at that time had really just been discovered. These what are called manganese nodules, which are rich in copper and nickel, and as well as manganese. Potentially in the long term may turn out to be very valuable resources for human civilization. And so because of the flaws in the perceived flaws in the Law of the Sea Convention, the United States and these other nations decided that they would try to set some structure by which they would regulate the activities of their constituents that might seek to benefit from these resources in the deep sea. Nothing has really happened yet, but there's still some people are looking at that very carefully. And then we have the International Space Station Agreement of 1988. Now, space law itself, as I indicated earlier, I interpret as being permissive primarily because it allows, specifically allows the use of lunar resources. That word use, I think, can be very broadly interpreted. So, particularly if your signatory, like the United States, interprets it that way, and in that regard, private, government, multilateral, and international initiatives are equally permissible under the Outer Space Treaty, as I see it. A private entity, however, must be sponsored or licensed by a party to the treaty, and I don't see any reason why that should bother anybody. It is the only truly operative space treaty relative to resources, as I see it. Implementation of the Moon Agreement would be self-defeating, as I indicated earlier, and a private property regime, however, is probably essential ultimately to fully realize benefits. The Outer Space Treaty does not create any kind of private property regime. It doesn't create a claim regime. There's nothing in there. And again, in chapter 12 of that book, I suggest what a claim regime might consist of, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. I think there is an urgency to have a claim regime, if only to prevent international conflict over these resources. The Chinese have indicated great interest and great capability ultimately to access lunar resources. Russia talks about it a lot. They do not really right now have the economic or technical capability to do that, although there are rumors of them joining with the Chinese in this regard. Those lunar resources consist both of this helium-3 energy resource that I mentioned earlier, as well as the resources necessary for lunar settlement. That includes hydrogen, water that you can make by heating the regolith to 600-700 degrees. You get about a third of the hydrogen off as water because of reactions with the silicate minerals that are in the regolith and the glasses that are in the silicate glasses in the regolith. From the water, of course, you can extract oxygen. Helium in general is a very important resource. In fact, that is something that ultimately may be brought back to Earth because we are running out of helium here on Earth. At least we think we are. Helium, the helium-4, which is the helium you have in your birthday balloons, most of it is increasingly in short supply, and the cost is going up. So you may actually bring that back as well. And then there are carbon and nitrogen compounds, CO2, methane, ammonia, and compounds of that nature that can be made on the moon from these solar wind volatiles. And then there's always in the future someplace Mars exploration and settlement. The moon may be the initial service station, if you will, in space to provide in a much lower gravitational field the kind of consumable resources that astronauts will need in order to both explore Mars and ultimately potentially to settle it. And then again, back to helium-3. Helium-3 is fusion is an ideal way to propel interplanetary rockets, our spacecraft. That works much better in a vacuum than it does here on Earth, and so it would be ideal. A linear system be an ideal way in which we could get to Mars faster and also supply power on both the Moon and Mars in the long term. And the initial consumable resources are there. So I think there is an urgency for, at the very least, the United States to say what kind of claim regime they will recognize on the Moon and try to bring in, as they did with the reaction to the Law of the Sea Convention, bring in other nations to come to some agreement on what that claim regime might be. We maybe later in the afternoon we can talk some more about what might be in that. I think an international agreement, broad international agreement through the UN on a workable claim regime is highly unlikely. It would be, the UN is an anti-free enterprise organization. And all you have to do is look at the Moon Agreement to see that that is true. Unilateral declaration by the United States or a multilateral treaty by some number of like-minded signatories to the Outer Space Treaty, I think is probably the ideal solution. The basic elements are, as I indicated in chapter 12 of this book. And so there is I think a great potential for lunar resources to move and to support civilization's movement into deep space. We'll just have to see whether or not the legal regimes that develop in the future are going to be supportive of that or actually keep it from happening. And with that, you want to go ahead with the next one, and
Sure.
we can take questions later?
Yes. Thank you, Harrison. What we'll do